Josephine Aldridge was 40 years old, and for 12 years she had been the quiet constant at the edge of her husband's ambition. The woman who handled the details, smoothed the introductions, and made the life he presented to the world run without visible effort. She clipped her own nails. She ironed her own blouses. She drove a 4-year-old Volvo that she kept maintained but never replaced, because replacing it would have required an explanation she did not feel like offering. The partners at her husband's firm called her gracious, which is what people say about a woman when they cannot think of anything more specific. She smiled at the word every time she heard it, because gracious was exactly what she needed them to see. When Terrence filed for divorce, he did it through a law firm he had retained 6 months in advance. His attorney called her attorney on a Tuesday morning in March to say that his client was prepared to begin asset division proceedings. The total marital estate, as Terrence had calculated it, came to just over $500 million. He had sent a bottle of champagne to his girlfriend's apartment that evening. A mutual acquaintance told her this. She had noted it without comment. What Terrence had spent 12 years failing to ask, what his attorneys had spent 6 months failing to investigate, was whose name appeared on the foundational documents of every significant asset in that calculation. It was not his. It was not hers. It was her father's. $500 million, 0 of it reachable. He had celebrated an inheritance that had never legally belonged to either of them. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. Philadelphia mornings in early spring carried a particular quality of damp cold that settled into the bones of the old row houses on the west side of the city and required a certain patience to move through. Josephine was at the dining room table by 6, her coffee going cool beside her, reviewing a portfolio of municipal bond documents that her work as a corporate attorney required her to study before a 9 o'clock call with the bond counsel in Harrisburg. The table was mahogany, 40 years old, salvaged from her father's office when he retired and refinished by Josephine's own hands over a long Thanksgiving weekend 8 years prior. She had stripped it down to bare wood and rebuilt the finish in 7 coats. 1 coat per day, and the result was a surface so deep and even it looked like something poured rather than applied. Her father, a man named Gerald Aldridge, was 74 years old and still living in the house in West Oak Lane where Josephine had grown up. He had spent 38 years as a trust and estate attorney before his retirement, and he had a mind that cataloged legal instruments the way other men cataloged sports statistics, with effortless precision and a quiet pleasure in the detail. He had told her once, when she was in her 2nd year of law school, that the most important document in any family was not the will. It was the one that came before the will, the one that determined whose name held what before anything else was decided. She had written that down in the margin of a casebook, and she had not forgotten it. She had met Terrence at a bar association event in Center City when she was 28 and he was 32, and working his way toward partnership at a commercial litigation firm with the kind of focused sociability that reads as warmth at a distance. He had found her across the room before she noticed him, which she later learned was his habit. He had a talent for identifying the most useful person in any gathering and orienting himself toward them. She had not known, at 28, that she was being identified as useful. She had thought she was being found interesting. She had found him interesting in return, and they had talked for 2 hours, and 11 months later they were married in a ceremony her father had paid for, with the composed generosity that characterized everything he did. The early years had been good. She did not pretend otherwise. Terrence had been attentive and curious, and he had asked about her cases with what seemed like genuine interest. They had built a life together in the house in Chestnut Hill that Josephine had decorated with careful patience over 4 years, choosing each piece of furniture and each fixture the way she chose her legal arguments, with full awareness of how it would hold up under scrutiny. What changed was a slow erosion, not a rupture. The attentiveness became selective, the curiosity redirected. She noticed, in the way that attorneys notice inconsistencies in testimony, the small, accumulating details. A weekend conference that produced no notes and no named attendees. An expense line in the household account for a jeweler she had never visited. A new warmth in how he described a colleague named Vanessa Platt, who worked in his firm's appellate division and who Josephine had met exactly twice, both times briefly. She had filed each detail away and continued her work. The signal arrived on a Wednesday evening when she returned early from a client dinner and found Terrence on the back porch, his phone face up on the patio table. A message visible on the screen from a contact saved only as V. The message contained 2 sentences. She did not need to read both to understand the situation. She did not touch the phone. She did not alter her expression. She went inside and poured a glass of water and stood at the kitchen counter for a moment, listening to the sound of the city at the edge of the yard. And then she went upstairs to her study and sat down at the desk where she kept her personal files. Her face was perfectly calm. She opened her laptop and she began at the beginning, because she was an attorney, and attorneys began at the beginning. She pulled 3 years of joint bank statements, which took 20 minutes and which she had full authorization to access. She sorted the transactions by vendor. She found the jeweler, 4 separate purchases over 19 months, totaling $23,400. She found a hotel she did not recognize, 11 separate charges over 2 years, always on weekends Terrence had attributed to golf outings or college friend visits, totaling $8,700. She found a restaurant in Washington she had never been to, charged 11 times in 15 months, always Friday evenings. She cross-referenced every charge against Terrence's calendar, which she still had view access to through a shared account he had not thought to restrict. 14 of the hotel charges corresponded to calendar blocks marked simply as out of office. The restaurant charges corresponded to trips he had logged as client dinners for a regional financial services firm, a client she had met once at a holiday party, and who was based, she now confirmed, in Richmond and not Washington. He had been in Washington on those Fridays, not Richmond. She documented everything. She photographed each statement with her phone. She exported the calendar records to her personal encrypted drive, the existence of which Terrence had never inquired about, because he had a general assumption about his wife's technical habits that was approximately 12 years out of date. Then she opened the folder she kept at the back of the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet in her study, the folder she had organized and updated annually for 6 years, at her father's quiet insistence. It was labeled simply with her father's initials. She looked at the first document for a long moment. Then she closed the folder and placed it in her briefcase. She picked up her phone and called her father. He answered on the second ring, the way he always did, as though he had been expecting the call. She told him it was time. He said he knew. He said he would call Gerald Whitmore first thing in the morning. Some questions, her father had always told her, answer themselves. You just have to be patient enough to let them. Gerald Whitmore had been her father's estate attorney for 22 years. A meticulous man of 68 with an office on Walnut Street that smelled like old leather and contained, among other things, the complete documentation of the Aldridge Family Irrevocable Trust, which had been established by Gerald Aldridge 14 years prior, 2 years before Josephine's marriage, and which held, in the names of Gerald Aldridge and his designees, a portfolio of commercial real estate properties in Philadelphia, Camden, and Wilmington, a set of investment accounts managed by a private wealth firm in Conshohocken, and a controlling interest in a privately held property management company that Josephine had served as an officer of for 9 years. The total assessed value of assets held within the trust, as of the most recent annual valuation, was $493 million. None of it was marital property. None of it had ever been marital property. The trust had been established before the marriage, had never been commingled with marital funds, and had been structured with legal precision by 2 experienced estate attorneys who had anticipated exactly this kind of inquiry. Josephine had never listed these assets on a joint financial disclosure. There had never been a joint financial disclosure that covered them, because Terence had never asked for one during the marriage, and in 12 years had never once sat down with a CPA and asked what his wife's complete financial picture actually looked like. He had assumed with the confidence of a man who believed he had already assessed the room. She sat across from Gerald Whitmore 2 days after calling her father, with the trust documents on the table between them and her own briefcase of joint account records beside her chair. And she listened to him confirm what she already knew with the even calm of someone describing the weather. She asked one question. She said, "Is there anything in Terence's current legal filing that reaches the trust assets?" Gerald Whitmore said, "Not a single instrument." She nodded. She picked up her pen. Preparation, her father had told her, was not a strategy. It was a posture. You either lived in it or you didn't. 4 days later, she drove to West Oak Lane and sat with her father on the back porch of the house she had grown up in the iron chairs he had bought the year she was born, and that he maintained with annual touch-ups of black paint from a can he kept in the garage. It was cold enough for coats. He brought out 2 cups of tea and set them on the small table between the chairs, and they sat for a while without speaking, the way they had always been able to sit without speaking, which was one of the things she valued most about him. She told him what she had found in the joint accounts: the $23,000 in jewelry, the hotel charges, the pattern of Washington Fridays. He listened with his hands around his mug and his eyes on the backyard where the forsythia was just beginning to show yellow. When she finished, he said, "He built his exit on the wrong foundation." She said, "Yes." He said, "That tends to be an expensive mistake." She held that exchange on the drive home and let it settle into the cold, clear place that had replaced the grief, and found it fit there precisely. By the following week, her attorney Patricia Sims had assembled the full counter-disclosure. Patricia was 55 years old and had practiced family and commercial law in Philadelphia for 27 years, and she had, when Josephine first presented the trust documentation to her, set her pen down very deliberately and looked across the desk with an expression that was not surprise, but something closer to professional appreciation. She had said, his attorneys valued a $500 million estate without doing a chain of title search on the underlying assets. Josephine had said, apparently. Patricia had said, that is a significant oversight on their part. She had picked up her pen again. Let's make sure it costs them accordingly. The picture on Vanessa Platt came through Patricia's investigator by Thursday. She was 36 years old, a 9th-year associate in Terence's firm, and she had been in a documented personal relationship with him, based on hotel records and a lease co-signed in her name and Terence's for a condominium in Rittenhouse Square for 22 months. The condominium had been signed 11 months before the divorce filing. The lease was $6,400 per month. Terence had been covering it from a personal account that drew quarterly transfers from the marital investment portfolio, transfers that Patricia's forensic review identified as $76,800 over 11 months, structured to remain beneath the threshold that would trigger a joint account notification. He had been funding a second residence for nearly a year. He had done it carefully. He had not done it carefully enough. That Thursday evening, Josephine made dinner. She set the table in the dining room. At the mahogany table she had refinished with her own hands. And she asked Terence how the Harrisburg deposition had gone, and he said long, and she said she understood, and passed him the bread, and asked about a partner dinner scheduled for the following week, and he said he thought he could make it. She refilled his water glass and told him she might have an early call Friday morning. He said that was fine. He was not watching closely enough to see anything. She drove. The mediation session was held in a conference room at Patricia's firm on the 14th floor of a building on Market Street, with a view of the Delaware in the distance. Patricia sat beside Josephine, Terence and his attorney, a man named Fletcher who wore confidence the way some men wore cologne, applied heavily and at close range, sat across the table. Fletcher opened by summarizing the marital estate as Terence's team had valued it. He used the 500 million figure with the ease of a man who had been living with it for months and had come to think of it as settled. He described the proposed division framework. He spoke for 11 minutes. Then Patricia placed the trust documentation on the table. She did not arrange it theatrically. She placed it in a single organized stack, and she said, in the tone of someone stating a scheduling detail, "Before we proceed with any division framework, we need to address the foundational issue. The assets your client has been treating as marital property are held, in their entirety, within an irrevocable trust established 14 years ago by Gerald Aldridge, Josephine's father, prior to this marriage. The trust has never been commingled with marital funds. It has never been subject to joint titling. It is not a marital asset under Pennsylvania law, under federal estate law, or under any instrument your client's team appears to have reviewed." Fletcher looked at the documents. He looked at his client. He looked back at the documents. Terence's expression moved through its stages with a visibility that Josephine observed the way she observed testimony, for what it confirmed rather than what it said. Fletcher asked for a recess. Patricia said he was welcome to take one. During the recess, Josephine sat at the conference table with her hands folded and her coffee cooling, and she looked out at the Delaware, and she thought about her, father's office and the mahogany table and the 7 coats of finish she had applied with the patience of someone who understood that the final surface was only as good as what held it up from underneath. When Fletcher and Terence returned, Fletcher said that his client would need time to review the trust instruments before any valuation discussions could proceed. He said this was unexpected. He said it with the carefully modulated tone of an attorney, trying not to show how badly his footing had shifted. Terence said her name. He said it the way he said most things, with the residual confidence of a man who had not yet fully updated his model of the situation. He said the trust was a technicality. He said there were equitable arguments. He said surely they could find a reasonable path forward. Patricia said, "The trust is not a technicality. It is a legal structure that predates this marriage by 2 years and has been maintained with full statutory compliance throughout. There is no equitable argument that reaches it." Josephine looked at her husband across the table. She let herself look at him for a full, unhurried moment. Then she said, "You spent 12 years watching me and deciding what I was made of. You decided I was the kind of woman whose whole life was visible from where you were standing. You never once looked at what was standing behind me." She gathered her documents. She put on her coat. She said goodbye to Patricia. She did not look back at the conference table, or at Terence, or at Fletcher, who was already leaning in to say something to his client that would not help him. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. The doors opened. She had been an attorney for 15 years. She understood exactly what it meant that the documents were clean. 11 months later, the Philadelphia summer had crested and begun its slow withdrawal, and the first cool evenings of September had returned to the city. And Josephine Aldridge was on the back porch of her father's house in West Oak Lane, in one of the iron chairs she had known since childhood. With a glass of iced tea and the draft of a pro bono brief she was writing for a housing rights organization in North Philadelphia. Her father was inside. She could hear him moving in the kitchen with the deliberate steadiness of a man who had long ago made his peace with doing things slowly and correctly. A man named Darius Cole sometimes joined her on this porch. He was a civil rights attorney she had known professionally for 3 years and who had asked her, 6 months ago at a bar association luncheon, whether she would want to have dinner sometime, in the direct and uncomplicated way of someone who had thought about it and decided to say so. She had said yes. He was careful and principled, and he asked questions that assumed she had already thought the thing through, which was the quality she valued most. He was not the center of the scene. He was simply part of it. Her practice had expanded in the months since. She had taken on 2 new corporate clients and had joined the board of a community development financial institution that worked in the neighborhoods where she had grown up. The work was good, and it was real, and it was entirely hers. She had heard about Terrence through a former colleague who mentioned it in passing, without dwelling on it. The divorce had settled at a fraction of what his attorneys had originally sought. The marital estate, stripped of the trust assets, came to approximately $4 million in jointly titled property, divided evenly. Vanessa Platt had left the firm 3 months after the mediation. Terrence had taken a lateral position at a smaller firm in New Jersey. His professional mentor, a named partner who had championed his career for 8 years, had not extended the expected reference when the new firm called. Josephine listened to this and said she was sorry to hear it, and meant neither more nor less than the words contained. She turned a page of the brief and made a note in the margin in the precise, angular handwriting her father had recognized in her since she was 7 years old, and she watched the late afternoon light move through the forsythia at the edge of the yard. The same forsythia that had been there her entire life. Yellow every spring without being asked and green the rest of the year without complaint. Her father's voice came from inside, asking if she wanted more tea. She said yes, please. She heard him moving to the kitchen, and she looked out at the yard, and she held the quiet of it, and she thought about the document in the bottom drawer that had been the answer to a question no one had ever thought to ask. And she thought about what her father had told her in law school about the document that came before the will, and she thought that some kinds of protection were built so far in advance of the thing they were protecting against that by the time the threat arrived, the protection had become invisible. That was the whole point. That had always been the whole point. She had built everything worth keeping. It had been held safely all along. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.